Welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whomever you love, you're welcome here. My name is James Carroll, and this is our adult religious education class. Lecture 17, we're going to talk about the Passover and the parting of the Red Sea. I want to remind everyone that we have a course webpage, sites.google.com, View Biblical Scholarship and Literacy, and it has a syllabus, links to all the recordings that we've made, and handouts, sort of thing. Today, we want to talk about Exodus 11, and I put 2:18, but we'll probably be lucky if we make it to Exodus 15. We'll see how far we can go. That's the material of the Passover, the slaughter of the lamb, the blood on the lintels, and then the death of the firstborn, through the parting of the Red Sea and the journey to Mount Sinai. So if you want to review where we've already been, you remember that the Israelites were slaves to the Egyptians. The Egyptians killed their children and drowned them in the Nile. And the midwives saved the children, and some of the children, and Moses was saved by being put in a basket. He was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. He killed somebody, so he fled, ended up in Midian, where he found a burning bush. That told him that the god of the Canaanites, El, was actually also known as Yahweh, who we think is the god of the Midianites, where he was living. And he was told to go back and set the people free. And then we had the 10 plagues. And we covered the first 9 of the 10 plagues briefly. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about that 10th plague and pick up where we ended. The main point from the plagues was that they were a judgment. So we haven't actually got to Exodus 12, but I skipped ahead to use this verse. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. The plagues are designed to show that God is superior to the Egyptian gods. So for example, we start with the blood in the Red Sea, and that's a judgment on Hapi. And then we get the frogs, that's a judgment on the god of fertility, etc., all the way to the god of death, Osiris, and showing that Yahweh, he is the god of over all these things, superior to the Egyptian gods. This assumes that the Egyptian gods exist. So the authors of the text at this point in time were not monotheists. They were henotheists or monolatras, meaning they believed in multiple gods, but they believed their God was the best, or their God was at least the one that they were supposed to worship. They had a special covenant, a special place with their God, and that they were only supposed to worship that one God, not that the other gods did not necessarily exist. We also had that movie night. I don't know how some of you were there, but I think some of you weren't. We watched Prince of Egypt, which is this recent animated depiction of the Exodus story. So if you wanted to see how the story has been interpreted in modern culture, that's a good way to do that. We also are considering a movie night for the 10 Commandments. That is a much longer movie. It's an old movie with really, old cheesy graphics and stuff compared to today. And so if we did a movie night for the 10 Commandments in its long, how many hour glory, who would come to that one? Is it worth? Okay, so I'll see if I can set that up sometime in the next month or 2 months, and we'll watch the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments goes further than the Prince of Egypt. It takes us all the way through, the golden calf and the 10 Commandments actually coming down from the mountain, whereas Prince of Egypt stops kind of at the Exodus, at the parting of the Red Sea. So we'll go a little bit further in our story, and then we'll go back and watch the 10 Commandments. So I also want to point out that since we're talking about Passover, there's at least one previous lecture that I gave that's relevant. I'm not going to duplicate all that material, but if you're interested, last Easter I gave a talk on biblical festivals where we talked in part about Passover and how it related to the Christian Easter, which is very much related to what we're discussing today. So that's relevant. All right, so the first thing I kind of want to say here is that those plagues have a certain literary form. For example, Plague 1, Plague 4, and Plague 7 all have the same introduction structure, and Moses goes to Pharaoh and talks to Pharaoh, and the whole thing is set up in a very discrete structure with very specific words that are repeated, and they are repeated in Plague 1, 4, and 7. And then plague 2, 5, and 8 also have repeated words. And then plague 3, 6, and 9 are kind of these short little blurbs with very little. But again, there's a difference in how the first plague, the second plague, and the third plague are introduced. But then that pattern is repeated in the 4th, 5th, and 6th, and then repeated again in the 7th, 8th, and 9th. And then the 10th comes as a culmination. We've seen this sort of thing before. And we saw it in the creation account. Do you remember that? So in the creation account we had light and dark, water and sky, earth and plants. We had the sun and the moon, the fish and the birds, animals, etc. So we've seen this same pattern before in the creation account. So you'll see the hand of the same sort of editor, redactor, and author in these two accounts, and he likes to have this sort of pattern of repeating things. It helps you memorize the text. It helps you repeat it back. It's an evidence of some sort of, probably an evidence of literary intent and or oral tradition. But it tells us we're dealing with the same author. It also tells us that the author sees a connection between the plagues and the creation account. That those are actually related in their mind. So, let's see. There are some themes here. And we just saw one of them, and that's that creation theme, right? The repetition of the themes is meant to point out the creation. But there's lots of repeated phrases that come up, and then there are puns on them and there are plays on them. One is cry, right? The Israelites cry to the Lord because under the bondage of Egypt, they cry up to the Lord, and the Lord hears and listens and hearkens, etc. But then we get Pharaoh, and he says, I will not hear. I do not know your God. And then eventually the Egyptians, after the death of the firstborn, will cry. And there will be a cry in Egypt. So again, those passages are very carefully and skillfully woven to create a literary pattern or irony between the cry of the Israelites and the cry of the Egyptians, between hearing and listening and knowing. So knowing is an important one. You remember this whole thing starts when Pharaoh says, I do not know this God. And why should he? Moses comes and says, Yahweh. And by the way, no one knew his name was Yahweh until I met him in the burning bush. But Yahweh, this God named Yahweh, he told me you have to let the people go and sacrifice to him and have a festival to him, or else he's going to smite us for not worshiping him like we're supposed to. That's why we have to go. And Pharaoh's response is, I do not know this God. And then in each of the plagues from there on out, the text will repeat over and over again, I'm doing this so that Pharaoh may know, or so the Israelites may know. So the signs are there, the plagues are there, and the signs are there so that the people may come to know that Yahweh is God. You can see how this would have been used years later as a religious polemic. You need to know who Yahweh is. You need to come to know Yahweh because he is our God and he saved us. And these stories then become how the people come to know who they are and who Yahweh is. And it has mythical importance. So when I talk about a text as a mythical text, remember, I'm not making a comment on its historicity. Some myths happen. They're historical. We use the term myth to mean something that didn't happen, right? But that's a colloquial use. In the scholastic use, myth means a story that is meaning-making. It's a story that teaches people who they are, where they live in the world, who their nation is. And examples of this in America might be Paul Revere or George Washington and the Cherry Tree. I cannot tell a lie. Or crossing the Delaware. You know, these stories and the founding fathers, you know, writing the Constitution. These stories have become mythical because they tell us who we are as a nation, why we're here, and what we're all about. They speak to ourselves about who we are. Those are myths. Although some of them are historical, and some of them probably aren't, like the cherry tree. So again, it's irrelevant of whether it happened. These stories are mythical, and the signs are evidence of that mythical nature, that Israel is supposed to know God because he's the God who provided these signs. There are references to things like the firstborn, and the celebrating of a festival, which will repeat over and over again. The firstborn Egyptians will be killed. God will say the firstborn belongs to me. You sacrifice a firstborn lamb. So we'll have to talk about the meaning and interpretation of that firstborn reference. It's obviously something the Christians will pick up on at a later date. where Jesus is the firstborn Son of God and the Passover lamb, and they'll tie all this firstborn stuff to Jesus. And again, there's the reference to the creation. We just talked about that. And the whole thing is meant so that you may remember who you are, remember where you came from, and remember that we were slaves in Egypt and God brought us free, and that's why we must keep the law. This culminates in the giving of the law. And the purpose of the law, or the law is seen as the price the people pay for their freedom. Like we keep this law, and it's a special law, and it has all sorts of restrictions on what we can eat and all that stuff. But the reason we do that is because Yahweh saved us from Egypt, and so we're asked to keep this law. So again, that's the law is a way that you need to remember why we're keeping the law. Okay, so festival. There are at least 3 festivals. Remember, the festival says, the text says, let us go so that we may keep a festival to Yahweh. And then what is that festival? Is that just an excuse? Right? Because it's almost, he's implying, we'll go away 3 days, keep a festival. We can't sacrifice in your land. We have to sacrifice in our own land. So go away 3 days, we'll make this, and then we'll come back, right? It's almost that's the implication. And Pharaoh's like, no, I don't trust you. I know you're just going to leave. Of course they are. But that's almost that's almost the deception and the back and forth between Pharaoh and Moses is the implication, we're just going to go away, we're going to sacrifice, and we're going to come back. Well, eventually, the plagues get so bad that Pharaoh just says, go and don't come back. So, what is the festival then? Is the festival just a ruse, or does it actually happen in the text? And there are at least 3 festivals that the Jews keep in the course of the text. The first is the Passover, where they actually, while they're in Egypt, sacrifice a lamb and do the Passover thing. But remember, they said the festival that we're there to keep, we can't keep in Egypt. We have to do it outside. So they go outside, they go to Mount Sinai, and then they have this thing, they sacrifice to the golden calf. They make a golden calf and hold a festival. This is this almost anti-God festival, which Moses is unhappy about, and there's a whole disagreement about whether this is the right way to worship God. Remember, that golden calf we saw is how El, the Canaanite god, had always been worshipped in the past. But now that El and Yahweh are considered the same God, can you still worship him that way? You can see why the Israelites might do this and why Moses is unhappy. And so this records this conflict between the new way that they're trying to get the people to worship Yahweh and the old way that they've always worshipped El in the past. And there's that festival outside of the land of Egypt, but it's not accepted, according to the text. And so then after that golden calf, they melt it down, they make the Ark of the Covenant, and then they keep another festival where they promise and covenant to keep the law. Because you set us free, we're going to keep the law. So those 3 festivals together form almost this complex of festivals in the text that is the fulfillment of this, we're going to leave to keep a festival. The festival becomes the point. It's not just a ruse. They actually are going out there. They actually are going to keep a festival. They're going to keep one before they leave. They're going to keep another one after they get there that is accepted. After they first do it wrong, then they'll do it right, and it'll be accepted. Again, this has, I think, some hints at the historicity of the struggles that the people went through when their worship changed. Because we know there was a historical point when the people's worship of El with the golden calves slowly shifted towards a worship of Yahweh without images. And so I believe this story is what we call mythicized history. It records some accurate representation of a real struggle, whether it happened here at Sinai, whether it actually happened as part of the Exodus, I don't know. But some sort of a real historical memory of the struggle that happened as the people changed how they worshipped God, from how they used to worship to how they're now going to worship as Israelites, which again became part of their national origin. So, we talked, when we talked about biblical festivals, we went through this entire festival complex that is associated with Passover. And it begins with the festival of unleavened bread in the 14th to 21st of Abib. Abib is like the 7th month of their year. And that's described in Exodus 12, 13, 23, Leviticus. So there's a lot of passages telling you how to keep the festival of unleavened bread. And that festival is when you take all the leaven out of your house. Leaven is yeast. And you only eat bread that has no leaven. We'll talk about what that means and how it's interpreted later. And then the Passover happens on the 14th. of Abib. And then there's this whole festival they have to celebrate with the Passover. And then there's the festival of the first fruits on the 16th, which is connected to the barley harvest. So it seems to me that this is a spring festival. And in every culture we've ever seen, they have spring festivals. And so it's almost certain to me that the early Israelites had a spring festival before the story of the Exodus was ever told, before the Exodus became a thing, whether it really happened or whatever. Before it became a thing, they were worshiping and holding a festival associated with spring and associated with the barley harvest at this time, which leads to the age-old question of it's which came first, the Easter bunny or the egg. But it's which came first, the ritual or the myth. Because myths are designed to explain the purpose and meaning behind ritual. And rituals are created to memorialize the events of mythology. And so we have this circular feedback loop where there is a myth, so they create a ritual to memorialize it so you never forget what happened. But we also have rituals that pre-existed. And then we create a myth about why we do the thing we do. Examples in Christian theology are easy to find, things like the Christmas tree. It predated Christianity, but there are Christian symbols attached to it later. So they explain, why do we do the Christmas tree? Well, to remember Christ's birth, and we put the star on top, and we burn the Yule log. All those things predate Christianity, and yet there are Christian myths to explain why we do them. But there are also things we do, like set up a nativity, that are rituals we created after the myth to memorialize the myth. Right? So, which came first, the ritual or the myth? And in this case, it's so far back in time, we do not know. But there are hints that the ritual is at least older than the Exodus event or the Exodus story, whichever it is. We're not going to talk about historicity yet. But whichever it is, a myth or a story, the ritual predates it. And we get from these texts a description of some of these ritual events. And again, it's hard to tell how old each of these ritual elements are. So let's start in chapter 10, verse 27. It says, "The Lord, Yahweh, hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was unwilling to let them go. And so then Pharaoh says to him, 'Get away from me. If I ever see your face again, you will die.' And Moses said, 'Just as you say, I will never see your face again.'" That's after the ninth plague. So here comes the 10th plague. Now remember, we talked about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. In the logic of the narrative, it is God's intent to kill the Egyptians. That's where he wants to get. He's not doing it because Pharaoh hardened his heart. He's hardening Pharaoh's heart so that he can get to that point. And that's a very violent sort of thing. And it's not the sort of thing we would expect a loving God to do. And it leads to all sorts of consternation. But this is the way I think, and the way I deal with this is, and the way I think about this is an authentic expression of how early tribalistic people saw their God. That God is good and God is great and God is worth worshiping because he fights for us and he is just. And when our enemies commit genocide against us, he treats them harshly in retaliation. And that justice that God shows is what made in an early tribalistic culture, how those people of faith thought about God. And this is an expression of so again, as a historical document, it's valuable because it tells you something about how early people thought about justice, thought about God, and desired protection from their God. So let's skip to 11, but I guess to conclude, but it shouldn't mean that we today should take this as the standard of our morality, whether we believe in God or not. So even if you believe in the Bible, if you're a Bible-believing Christian, you can say something like, this is how they saw God, but I don't believe God is really violent like this. Or you can not believe in God and be an atheist, and you can say, well, I believe this is an authentic description of early morality. Notice how our morality has shifted for the better in today's world. And either way you look at that, you can gain something by studying the text without assuming that we have to match our morality to the text. And if we approach it that way, it becomes a much more interesting sort of exercise, and less likely to cause us to do things like fly airplanes into buildings. And all right, chapter 11. Yahweh said to Moses, I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt, and afterwards he will let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you away. Don't come back, sort of thing. So verse 4, Moses said, Thus saith Yahweh, about midnight I will go out through Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn female slave who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborns and the livestock. And then there will be a loud cry throughout all the land of Egypt. You notice the themes I mentioned? The cry and the firstborn. This text started because God came down and said, I have heard the cry of my people in Egypt. And now he's making the Egyptians cry. It started because Pharaoh was murdering the children of the Israelites, and now God is going to kill the children of the Egyptians in retribution. And he even made sure it got to this point by hardening Pharaoh's heart to make sure we got to this point. But you see the reference to the themes, the firstborn, the cry, throughout a whole land of Egypt, such as never has been or never will again. That's a very memorable line in Prince of Egypt. If you were here last night, remember when Pharaoh, the authors of that story really wanted to make this connection clear. And so you remember they had Ramses point at Moses and say, my father knew how to deal with you people, and there will be a cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there never has been or never will again, because he's threatening to kill the Israelites in response to Moses' request to let them go. And Moses bows his head and says, "You bring this on yourself." And so they put that line in the mouth of Pharaoh instead of in the mouth of God, intentionally pointing out the parallel between what the Egyptians had done to the Israelites and what God will do to the Egyptians. Let's see. And then in verse 7 it says, I will do this so that they may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. You notice? So that they may know. I do not know this God, but I'm going to do this so that you may know not only that there is a God, but that he is distinguishing between Egypt and Israel. So again, you see the themes. And they're repeating throughout the whole text. I'm just pointing out one or two references to them. But if you go through and just underline every reference to cry, know, sign, right, you notice these, and firstborn, you notice these repeating patterns. Verse 9, and Yahweh says to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you. There's our listen. But he will not listen. In order that my wonders, my signs, may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. There's the plagues are signs so that you may know. And Moses and Aaron performed these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart and did not let the people of Israel go out of the land. So, chapter 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. That's how it starts. So here we're about to leave. This is the beginning of the leaving. We've done the wonders. We're going to do the last wonder, and he's going to let you go. And this month will mark for you the beginning of months. So Israelite calendar, if you read the Bible, is confusing because the first month is actually Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of months, and it's many months after Passover. So Israel had an existing political calendar that began on Rosh Hashanah, the first of the month. But this text says we're going to change the calendar so that Passover is the first month of the year. And so from this moment on, actually, there are two calendars and two numberings for the years, and it gets confusing because they refer to both throughout the text. So there's a religious, we divide it up this way. There's a religious calendar and a political calendar. And in the religious calendar, Passover is the first month of the year. It's a change from what things were previously. I think that is important because this is a beginning. Remember that one of the themes was creation. So this story is the creation of Israel, like the creation of the world, only now we're creating the nation of Israel. And as such, it's the first month of the year. We're starting over. We're going to start over. So the themes that we see from Firstborn on down have reference to creation in many important ways. So check this. Okay. This will be the first month of the year. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month you are to take a lamb for every family, a lamb for each household. And if a household is too small for a whole lamb, you join together, etc. Verse 5, your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male, and you shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation shall slaughter it at twilight. So we have two symbols. First, the lamb. The next is firstborn. The next is without blemish. And the next is slaughtered at twilight. What can you tell me about twilight? Why at twilight? Well, you remember the Passover is going to happen at midnight. So twilight, when the firstborn die. So twilight is before that. But twilight is also what we call the transitional or luminal space. It's the transition from one time to the next. So what have we got? The first month, slaughtered at twilight. Again, these are all rebirth, transition, or initiation texts. These are the sorts of things you might get in an initiation ritual. You know, when the man comes of age, you send him out into the wilderness at twilight. And again, it's the luminal space. And we'll see a lot more having to do with posts and lintels of doors in a minute. Slaughtered at twilight, and they shall take some of the blood and put it upon the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat of it. The door, again, is a liminal space. So liminal time, liminal space. You know what I mean by liminal? It means a transition. It's the place where you leave one space and enter another, like the lintel on the door. And so this is the door to your house. This is the space between your house and the world outside of it. And you're setting a distinction between your house and the world outside. And I wish I had brought a picture of this. But how many of you have seen a mezuzah? Do you know what a mezuzah is? It's a rolled up scroll with part of the Law of Moses written on it that is pinned to the sides of the doors of Jewish households. So if you kind of are wandering through a neighborhood, you can tell when you find an observant Jewish household because they'll have one of these things on the side of their doors. And so there they're marking the door with the law. And here we're marking the door with the blood. Which raises an interesting question for me. Does God need, and did the Israel, if you don't believe in God, that's not even an interesting question, but let's put it a different way then. Did the Israelites believe that God needed blood on the door to tell the difference between the people he should kill and the people he should spare? Is God that stupid? I don't think the Israelites thought God was that stupid and needed it. And so I don't think that's what the blood is really for. What else could it be for? Let's think for a minute. I'm going to spout out my theories, but I want you to think about it for just a minute before I just give you my theory. But it's not just so that God can see. It says in the text, I will, when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will destroy you. But it's not that God needs the blood to tell who's an Israelite or not. The blood represents something else. It represents the sign of the covenant and the sign that you are obedient, that you are in the in crowd, that you are. And it's for the Israelites to distinguish themselves with the blood of this sacrifice from the Egyptians. And through that act, they purify themselves, they set themselves apart, and thus they are preserved by God when he comes. Now, that raises another interesting, which came first, chicken or the egg, story. Let's first say the Exodus happened just like the Bible says. We'll talk about that later, but let's say it did. Is this the first time they're sacrificing lambs like this? Or is the story using an existing sacrifice that was part of an existing spring festival? Or let's now look at it another way. Let's say that later on they invented this story. Did they take an existing festival and write this myth to explain why lambs were sacrificed? Or were lambs sacrificed because of this story? This is the which came first, the chicken or the egg ritual question. And it's related to the other question I asked. Did the authors of the story think that God needed to see blood to tell the difference between who he's supposed to kill and not? Is God so crazy that he can't tell who he's supposed to kill and who he's not unless he sees blood? I don't think so. I don't think the authors thought so. But then where did this ritual act come from? And let's say even that it was invented at this moment by revelation from God. Let's grant all of that. God speaks to people according to their language, or else he's not a very intelligent God worth paying any attention to. So if God were to reveal this to people, what did it mean to the people he was revealing it to? They must have had some context for this act that they would have said, I know what this is about. Right? So my point in asking it this way is, whatever you believe about this story, whether it happened, whether you believe in God or whether you don't, there's a really interesting question that you should ask, and that is, what is the cultural context of this action? And you should be able to ask that question and find it equally interesting whether you're a believer or a non-believer. Because even if you believe this is a revelation directly from God, there must have been some sort of cultural context that would have made it make sense to the people God asked to do it. So, what do we know or think we know about acts like this in the ancient Near East? Let's read the act, and then I'm getting ahead of myself. Your lamb's without blemish, you'll put its blood on the doorposts. And then verse 8, they shall eat the lamb that same night, and they shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over fire with its head, legs, and its inner organs, and you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. So there's all sorts of ritual requirements there. You take the whole thing together. You burn it all. You either eat it or you destroy it all with fire. It's to be roasted, not boiled. And its blood is to be put on the posts of your door as a sign that you're part of Israel, not part of Egypt, so that I will pass over you and not the others. So this is the unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is bread without yeast. And bitter herbs, usually today they eat horseradish. And I have a really great story where I'd had, that watered down horseradish you put kind of on fish. And so I didn't think it was going to be terribly bitter. And I went to a Passover with a Jewish family, and they warned me, this is really bitter stuff, be careful. And I was like, oh yeah, I've had horseradish before. And I took a big spoonful, and I stuck it in my mouth. And I felt like somebody had punched me in the gut, and I thought I was going to die. And I couldn't breathe for about a minute. I really couldn't breathe. I thought, like when you get the wind knocked out of you. And I thought I was going to hyperventilate and possibly die because I could not draw breath. It was really bitter stuff. So the bitter herbs in late Judaism, that's easy. It's interpreted as the sorrow of their bondage. So you eat it with the bitter herbs to remember the sorrow of the bondage and the tears that they shed in bondage. But you eat it with unleavened bread because they had to bake their bread so fast that it didn't have time to rise. So no yeast. Right? That's the later interpretation. But then do these things have earlier antecedents in these spring festivals? So let's talk about this. First, let's do the roasted bit. Roasted, not boiled. In Greece, we know something about how they thought of sacrifice. You would burn the sacrifice, roasted on an altar, and the smoke would go up to heaven. And they even have this great myth that we should tell sometime about how the people tricked God into accepting the innards, and God and the people got the meat they could actually eat. That's a very interesting myth where you take the whole animal, you roast it, then the people eat the ribs and the thighs and all the good meat stuff, and then the innards you burn up on a fire, that which is left, and God eats the smoke. So you give the parts that humans can't eat anyway to God in sacrifice, and then the God eats the smoke, and so we get to give God the part we wouldn't use anyway. It's a very kind of clever Greek myth. But it also describes these gods, eating the smoke or eating the sacrifice through the smoke. So here we have the whole thing roasted with the innards, and the people eat part of it, and all the parts they don't eat, they burn up. To me, that sounds an awful lot like this kind of Greek myth that we have about sacrifice and God, eating the smoke, etc., which could be part of an earlier myth, an earlier knows which came first, the ritual or the myth. This could be part of an earlier ritual that these people did before the Exodus came, and then it was reinterpreted. So the reasons were reinterpreted to be about the Exodus. But this could explain this in an earlier text. You burn the whole thing, you eat the parts that are edible, the parts that aren't, you burn up the rest of them on the fire, and the smoke goes up to God, and he eats it. Sounds a lot like the Greek myth to me. We have one more here. This is from William H.C. Propp, who wrote the Anchor Bible Commentary on Exodus, which is very good, by the way, if you want a good commentary. It covers a lot of these issues very well. It says, thus the requirement may be to eat the meat in a primitive manner, but not so primitive as to transgress the raw flesh of the taboo. This is mentioning that boiling is a more takes more technology. This is a raw, more primitive way of doing it. He also points out that the earlier sacrifices, many of the other sacrifices commanded in the text are boiled. So this is one of the few that's burned. Yeah.
Raw flesh is considered taboo in Jewish diet.
Yes. Because you can't eat the blood. And so it's saying you don't transgress the taboo, but you eat it primitively, but not so primitive that you transgress. It says raw meat is the equivalent of raw grain. He's going to now connect it to the unleavened bread. Raw meat is the equivalent of raw grain, which you don't eat. Stewed meat is the equivalent of leavened bread, right? Because it's stewed and it ferments, and you can make beer that way, and you can make barley that way, and you can make leavened bread that way. It rises with the yeast. And then he says roast meat is the equivalent of unleavened bread. So maybe this idea of roasting this sacrifice instead of boiling it as compared to others is a connection to this whole point of this festival. It's an unleavened bread festival. And then he says, well, what does the unleavened bread represent? Roast meat is the equivalent of unleavened bread. Unleavened cakes symbolize purity, and the analog, roasted meat, is passed through fire, the ultimate purifier that sends sacrifices to heaven again in the smoke, like the Greek myth. So this is I think, a reasonable description of kind of what these things may have meant to the people involved. That there is a representation of spring, a representation of purity, and this may have been an earlier festival, and the unleavened bread is interpreted in the later myth as we got to get out of here fast, so we don't have time for it to rise. But the earlier traditions, it probably had to do with purity and had to do with these earlier sacrifices that were part of an earlier festival that possibly predated the Exodus stories. And then this is the last bit about the lamb. Why a lamb and why the blood on the doors? It says, from Transjordan during a cholera epidemic, each family chose for itself a victim for sacrifice, immolated it, meaning they burned it, prepared it on the spot and distributed it to the poor, each having eaten of it themselves, and each family took some blood of the sacrifice in order to stain the front of its door with it. And then we have from a Punic, and that's a later story, but it's from some of these Transjordan Bedouin tribes. We also have a Punic stela from Algeria that explicitly stated that spirit for spirit, blood for blood, life for life, a lamb as a substitute. Okay, what's happening here? Later on in the text, he will say, the firstborn belonged to me. But, meaning I spared your firstborn, so from this moment on, the firstborn belonged to me. Again, I think that's a memory, or that's a mythologized explanation for an earlier ritual where the firstborn were sacrificed to God. Firstborn lambs belonged to God, so they were sacrificed to God. And then they're saying the firstborn people also belong to God, possibly early child sacrifice. But we can make a substitute for our children and offer those to God instead through this sacrifice. And the substitute will let God spare us. We also have this early tradition represented by this Transjordan story where they feel like there's a destroying angel, a demonic thing out there in the world that is slaying people. These are epidemics, right? And during a cholera epidemic, what they do is they say, don't kill us by the cholera. Kill the lamb as a substitute for us. We'll put the blood on its door, and that's a symbol that we have given the substitute. Take the lamb, not us. So this is an early ritual magical practice for providing substitutes to spare people from plagues, etc. And so if we're piecing this together, my theory is there was an early practice for avoiding plagues that involved killing lambs and painting the posts of the door. The story of the Exodus borrows that motif because the people would have understood it, and turns the blood on the post of the door as the sign of you being an Israelite in the covenant with God. You eat the flesh of the animal, then you burn the rest. You just entered into a covenant meal with God. And through your covenant meal with God, you've become part of the nation of Israel. This is the creation story, remember, for Israel as a nation. So as we create the nation of Israel, you use a sign, just like circumcision, to show that you're in the in-group and you're spared because of it. And it's using the imagery from these earlier traditions of how you assuage demons so that they don't kill you. And again, you could accept that view of what just happened, whether you're a believer or not, because even a believer could say God might use symbols that the people would recognize from their own cultural context. Right? So you could accept that whatever you think about God, etc. Now, we've seen this same substitute theology before. This is the story of Abraham and Isaac, remember? And like I said, I mentioned the reference that this son might even go, the firstborn belonging to God might even go back to early human sacrifice. Remember, God commands Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, and then he says, no, don't kill him, I have a substitute. And the ram shows up in the thicket. So again, this substitute theology is in other places in the Old Testament. So, again, then in 12, we were just reading chapter 12. If we get down to verse 12, we get this reference. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments, for I am the Lord. Again, this is this reference to the other gods existing and God executing judgment. And then it says, the blood will be a sign for you, in verse 13, on your houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will destroy you. Doesn't that sound a lot like the cholera story we just told from the Bedouins? And then you will keep this as a perpetual ordinance forever. That's over in verse 17, I believe. In other words, so that you will remember the Exodus. All these rituals and all these myths have been woven together in a way that is supposed to be a national story so that they will remember where they came from and how God saved them. And then the firstborn, etc. Now, I'm running out of time, so I feel a little scatterbrained. I apologize because I'm trying to fit all this in, and we also started a few minutes late. Let's read chapter. This is chapter 13, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the Israelites of human beings and animals, it is mine." In the King James translation, that open the womb is called the open the matrix. And of course, this leads to I like to point out how these stories get woven into modern culture. That reference was woven into the mythology of the modern movies, The Matrix, where they talk about the opener of the matrix. They make a pun between that person and Christ. And the Christology is borrowed by this reference to the matrix. Of course, matrix is also a math reference to how we, put numbers in a square matrix of math numbers in linear algebra. And that's then reference to the computer code puns. So there's this great pun between matrix and the firstborn and Christ, and he's tying religion and science fiction together in a really fascinating way. So that's where that comes from. I like to point these out when we hit them. But Moses said to the people, "Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out by a strong hand." So again, the point of this whole thing is so you remember. The firstborn are mine, so you will remember. You also note, and I didn't spend a lot of time on this because we just don't have time, but you cannot understand the New Testament without understanding these themes. From the memory, the sign, to the firstborn, and the lamb, and the shepherd, and all of those references are co-opted by Christianity, and the Christian myth is replete with these images borrowed from this story as they see this story as a type of Jesus Christ, who is the lamb, who is the Passover, etc., who is the firstborn. All of this, of course, brings us to the Red Sea and its parting. And I am, oh my gosh, out of time. I'm trying to figure out if I should do the Red Sea next time. I think what I'll do is let me give you a very brief overview of the Red Sea story, because I just don't have time for anything else. and then we'll come back to it and do it in a little bit more detail, and then we'll talk about historicity next time. But let me give you a brief overview. If anyone knows kind of anything controversial about the Red Sea, it's that there's a debate about whether it's the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea. So I'm going to give you an overview of where that comes from. The Hebrew is Yam, which means sea, and Suf, which can mean, we know from Exodus chapter 2, can mean reeds. And Egypt is a land of reeds. This has led some scholars to assume that that's the earlier original story, and then actually maybe what happened is that the northern delta has lots of reeds, and maybe that land dried up, and so the Israelites were able to cross by over on dry land. But then it rained a little bit, and it got soggy and muddy, and the Egyptians were bogged down in the mud and couldn't follow. And maybe that's where this whole thing started. And then later, the story of walls on the left and right were added, and that's all based on this Reed Sea, because they argue the Red Sea doesn't really have a lot of reeds to it, so it's not a good description. Well, we also have this reference, though, this is in 1 Kings, a reference to where the Reed Sea, Yam Suf, is. And it says it's in the land of Edom, near Eloth, and it's right here. And he builds fleets, a fleet of ships that sail on the Red Sea, Yam Suf here. So if the tradition changes as to where the Red Sea is, it changes early. So I will admit that the literal text says Reed Sea, but we also have to admit that the Israelites, the early Israelites, thought the Reed Sea was right here, at the northern end of the Gulf of the Red, what we now call as the Red Sea. And the Greek translation of the text translates it Red Sea. That's why we've always translated it Red Sea. It comes through the Greek. The Greek translates it as the Red Sea. And so this is the traditional place. The text, however, says Reed Sea. And but the thing is, where is the Reed Sea? Is this the Reed Sea, or is it something up here in the marshes? And we don't know. And so the attempts to figure out not just where it happened, but where the people who wrote the story thought it happened is not an easy thing to solve. And it's led to a lot of controversy. But it's not, this dead... People seem to think it's done and finished, that it's the Reed Sea, not the Red Sea, and the Reed Sea is up in the marshes. I don't think that's obvious. It's not clear to us where it is. There's a whole thing about the mythology of the waters and parting them and what that meant to the people. And I really want to do that, and I want to do it well. I was going to summarize, but I think what we'll do is we'll just stop here, and I didn't get as far as I thought. And we'll pick this up next time, because I want to do a good job of the waters, because that is a really big story. And it goes all the way back to the UULA, and it has Egyptian counterparts and Israelite counterparts and Christian counterparts, and they all make a big deal of it. And so I think we ought to do it right. But the short answer, obviously, is that it's related to baptism, among other things, but for the Christians. But the whole thing is related to new birth, even for the Israelites. God creates the world by the wind over the water, and so here he's recreating Israel. So the Creator and the Redeemer are the same, and the act of redemption, of saving the Israelites from slavery, is the act of creation. And it's the Creator God who is redeeming them and is recreating them a new nation and taking them to the promised land and giving them a new law, etc. And that's the final theme, remember, was tied to creation. This is the point where it is most tightly tied, where creation is most explicitly referenced. And so we'll pick that up next time. And then I really want to talk about historicity, because we've been dancing around it for a long time, and we need to just talk about, did any of this happen? And there are parts of it we'll be able to point at and say, that didn't happen, and that we know that. And there's some other parts we can point at and say, that happened, we think, and we'll go through the whole thing and give the arguments and the evidence and let you choose for yourself. And a lot of people will like to argue it doesn't matter whether it happened. Its meaning is what matters. But let's face it, we're curious people. And so, I can't tell you the answer to that, but we're going to talk about it because it's at least fun and worth discussing. So All right, I'll see you next month, and we'll bring up the historicity and the parting of the Red Sea. Thank you much.